Nice to see everyone today. As I think each of you can see, I'm not Rabbi Feinstein. And that's because Rabbi Feinstein is a scholar in residence in Canada this weekend. The entire country has asked him to come and spend Shabbat with them. So he's visiting our dear friend Rabbi Moskowitz in Vancouver, and he's going to be speaking there. And so you're with me this morning, which is really great. It's nice to see everyone. I want to welcome everyone who's online and is visiting online from wherever you are. We're glad that you're able to be with us this morning. I see that you're waving at me, even though I don't have a monitor, so it's nice to know that you're probably waving. So a couple things. At the conclusion of study this morning, there is the kids' minyan service will be in this room. So if you are a kid at heart, you're welcome to stay for that and see the kids sing and dance. It'll be a lot of fun. The main sanctuary service is actually in Burdorf today, because we also have the wonderful Neshama Minyan, which is in Sherlopati, and we also have Teen Torah study and Tat Shabbat today. So if you understand, it's just a regular day at Valley Beth Shalom where there's only about 12 things to do on a Saturday morning. And then last night I know we had a wonderful Tamarim service and a Persian and Sephardic dinner. So I don't know if any of you guys went to it, but I heard it was really nice. So just another Shabbat at Valley Beth Shalom. So this morning what I want to do with you, we're going to look at the Parsha a little bit. But before we get into the Parsha, I want to lift up this idea, which is in this text study, which is this idea that God somehow has this attribute that we call chesed, which means loving kindness. Now, the word loving kindness as a word or as a hyphenated word didn't even enter the English lexicon until about 1953, I think. So this idea that we had loving kindness as an idea or a feeling, or can someone pass this back so we can, here you go, I would say in the long history of the Jewish people, 1953 might as well have been like last Tuesday, right? It's pretty, so, but this idea of chesed, and I would say this, I would say for our long history, we have been characterized by other religious people as not having chesed. We have been the people of the book, we have been the people of the law, we have been people of strict judgment, that study and legalistic thinking was the thing that made up who we were as a religion, and other religions, like especially Christianity in its early period, looked to us as a legal framework, and they were a framework where God equals love. So if I was a human being out in the world and I said, well, you have this entire hundreds of mitzvot that you have to follow to be one religion, or just experience love to be fulfilled in another religion, right? I mean, it's the greatest marketing campaign in the history of the world, right? And so for thousands of years, we have sublimated this idea that God, or even us as human beings, or as Jews especially, that love and kindness were sort of at the center of who we are. We don't have any holidays that celebrate chesed. We don't have any holidays that celebrate love per se. There's this little holiday called Tu B'Av, which is in the 15th of Av in the middle of summer. And that more has to do with friendship and romantic love, but the idea of love, and especially God's love. But the truth is, if you look back at our tradition, from its very beginning, chesed and rachamim, mercy, and chen, grace, are all attributes of God that are co-equal with judgment and righteousness and justice. And what's really interesting is that this idea of chesed appears more in the book of Genesis than any other book in the Bible. And except for 2 Samuel, has the same number of times it occurs. And this week's Torah portion has over half of the mentionings of the word chesed in the book of Genesis, which makes it line for line the most chesedic Torah portion in the entire Bible, right? We usually associate chesed with the book of Ruth, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But it's Chayei Sara where these ideas are first originated, especially when it's attached to God. So what I want to do is, before we get into the Torah portion, is to look at a little bit of the history of God's chesed. We'll look at the Torah portion and a couple of others, and then we'll end on the sheet again with some ideas that came out of the Talmudic period. Okay? Sound like fun? And if you have questions, please raise your hand. Someone's got a mic. I don't know who's going to be our Roche microphone today, but there is a mic. Bill, you want to be our... We have to use the mic only because people online have to be able to hear. All right, tell me your question and I'll repeat it.
You said in 1953, English started using the term loving kindness, right?
Yeah, like loving-kindness, right?
What did English use before?
I don't know. I don't actually know. I mean, it might just be kindness. It might just be friendship.
Because the word hased's been around for a long time.
Right, exactly. So let's take a look at the one sheet here. And then here's some more text sheets, so someone can help me carry those. Okay. So in our text, yes, sir.
Just one question. What happened in 1953?
Great question. The question was, what happened in 1953? I'm not really sure. I just know that was the first time that the Oxford English Dictionary used the term loving kindness. And it didn't exist before. But, I would be happy to look that up because it would be an interesting chapter of my book, to think about that, to put that in there. But I don't actually remember, but I'm happy to look that up. All right, so the first text we're going to look at is the second Mishnah in a book called Pirkei Avot, which for many of us is the source of what we would call Jewish ethics. Pirkei Avot is what B'nai Mitzvah students study. It's a very easy way to give a sermon off of something in here. These were they're called chapters of the fathers, although just really quickly, the word Pirkei Avot itself is a double entendre. So the word perik means chapter, and avot could either mean ancestor or father, but if you study other parts of Jewish life, avot also means maximum category. So it's an axiom, as opposed to a smaller category would be called a toledah in Hebrew, which means a specific. So just really quickly, for example, there are 39 categories of prohibited labor on Shabbat. Those are called the 39 Av Melachot, the ancestor Melachot, 39 prohibited labors. Anything that we derive from that are called toledot. Okay? So when this says Pirkei Avot, it both means chapters of the fathers and chapters of first-level principles, which you see how it's a double entendre, which is really lovely, right? It's a very Jewish thing to play with words that way. So this is the second Mishnah of the entire book. Okay? Let's take a look at what it says. You probably know this one, but because it's so cliche, it's worth looking at. David Foster Wallace, the great American writer, once said he had a whole dictionary of cliches, and the way he approached cliches was that he said the reason why something becomes a cliche is because it's actually true. Right? So we might feel like it's not as interesting, but let's slow down a little bit and look at something that we've known and probably read 100 times and look at it with fresh eyes. Shimon the righteous was from the remnants of the great assembly, and he would say, on three things the world stands: on Torah, on avodah, on service, and on gimilu chesed, or gimilu chasadim. So Torah, if you understand, is sort of like a platform, and it has three-legged stool. What are those three legs? The first is Torah. The second is avodah, which is prayer, giving service to God. And the third is chesed. So when I look at this, I think of course, the metaphor, which is the most stable platform you can have, is built on three co-equal pillars, right? So what do we learn from that? Torah. So studying Torah and also following Torah. So that would be law in this sense. The legal aspect of being in the covenant with God and with the Jewish people. The second is avodah, which is the theological relationship between each and every human being, in this case Jews, and the universe, or with God. And the third then, which is a co-equal partner with both Torah and avodah, or acts of loving kindness or acts of chesed. So the question is, does this mean that Torah is less important than we think it is? Or does it mean that chesed is actually more important than we think it is? That's a rhetorical question, of course. But the point is that the foundation of the world, according to the Mishnah, rests on those three pillars. On an understanding of our historical and future covenant with the Jewish people and with God, with a personal relationship with the universe, and with acts of loving kindness. It doesn't define what those acts are. I just want to be clear about that. But it defines that as a category and principle. Okay, let's look at the next text. So, the rabbis wanted to know then, what's Torah really about? And they say in Sota, Rabbi Simli is taught, with regard to Torah, its beginning is an act of kindness, and its end is an act of kindness. So before you get a little farther in the text, what is it saying? It's saying that the Torah's first action, the very first piece of narrative, has an act of chesed in it. That's what it means here, the word chesed. And the very last action is also an act of chesed. So if something begins and ends with chesed, then you assume, even not if everything in the middle is full of chesed, but that chesed itself is a full value. So let's take a look. What is the first act of chesed? In the beginning is an act of kindness, as is written. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife, Eve, garments of skin and clothed them. Anybody know about this part of the story? Anyone heard this part of the story? So what happens, right? God gets angry because Adam and Eve, created by God, were put in this garden, and there were two trees. And those two trees in the middle of the garden were the only trees they weren't allowed to eat, which is the worst psychological thing you can ever do to a human being, especially a new one like Adam or Eve, right? Is to say, anything is yours but those things. That's like me saying to you, what I really want you to do right now is not think of a pink hippopotamus with a bird on its head. Anyone able to not think of a pink hippopotamus with a bird on its head right now? Anyone not thinking of it? Because I'm thinking of a pink hippopotamus with a bird on my head right now, right? Psychologically, when you put something in someone's mind and you create this idea in their mind and you paint a picture of it, what's the one thing that you're thinking about? The very thing that you're told, not to think about, right? So if I'm God and I say, you can eat anything you want, but this beautiful tree right here and this beautiful tree right here, you can't eat those things.
So it's God's fault?
Yeah, sure. Why not? It's God's fault. We'll find everything is God's fault in the end, right? So Adam and Eve then, of course, get this idea in their head. And of course, Eve is a little bit helped along by this nefarious snake. And then she ends up eating of this fruit, waking themselves up to knowledge of good and evil. They eventually get cursed by God and kicked out. And God says to Eve, your curse is that when you have labor to give birth to another child, it will be very painful. And Adam's curse is that when you work the field, it will work against you, and you have to basically break your back and your hands to bring bread forth from the earth. Which, by the way, is a parallel. If you understand gender norms from the Bible, that's a parallel curse. Because women bring forth life into the world through childbirth, and men bring life into the world through cultivation. Right. Now, we live in a postmodern world, but I just think in a pre-modern biblical world, that seems as a co-equal statement. And then the last thing, though, that God does for them, because remember, what's the one thing that Adam and Eve want more than anything else after they eat of the fruit? That's correct, right? Adam and Eve, after they eat of the fruit and wake up their knowledge and become modest, the first thing they want to do is put on clothing. And so even though they ate of this fruit, and even though that God told them this one thing that they're not allowed to do, at the very end, God says, your life is going to look not as great as it was before, but then we have this line that God clothed Adam and Eve. He gave them the one thing that they wanted, that they felt that they needed, even though they broke the rules. And the rabbis see that as the first act of chesed. Yes, I see a question over here.
I always thought that God didn't purposely what he created. That's why he created those three and tested Adam and Eve and see what is happening.
Yeah, so the question was is that I thought that God wanted to basically allow us to become the people that we are, right? And it was, I wouldn't say a test, but it was more of a proving up, almost like the first camping trip you take your daughter or your son on, right? And they struggle a little bit. But that struggle is part of the experience of becoming a human being, and God delighted in that, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's his fault. I think
Right.
it's the way of.
Well, I would say that the curse from God, even though it feels pretty bad to us when you read it, it gives human beings purpose, right? If everything was ever handed to you, and you never had to work for it, how do you grow as a human being? And so I think it's a matter of perspective. What looks like a curse might actually be a blessing in that case. And anyway, so God is giving Adam and Eve clothing, and then that the rabbis see that as the opening act of chesed. Yes? Please use the mic.
I think by not following God's order, Adam elevated its status from superhuman to humans. Instead of being an angel, he is a man, human, which is not more superior than angels.
That's possible. That I would argue it a little differently. I would say that being thrown out of the Garden of Eden made us human beings. Right? Adam and Eve weren't. Just to be clear, Adam and Eve were not technically human beings. What makes, in Hebrew, the word for human being is b'nei Adam, which means children of Adam. So how can Adam be a human being if subsequent people are human beings? Like, here's the thing. You ever go to an art gallery anywhere in the world and you see paintings of Adam and Eve? You know that every single one of them is anatomically incorrect. Because Adam and Eve in those art galleries have something that Adam and Eve never had. Can anyone name what that thing is? A belly button. Because you only have a belly button because you're attached to a uterus, right? You have through a placenta, right? Which means that if the first human beings were formed out of the dust of the earth, there was no reason for them to have a belly button, right? So my whole point, though, is that it's their children that become the actual first human beings, right? I see your hand, but I do have to move on because we have so much more to learn today. Such a longer road ahead of us. All right, so then the Torah also ends with an act of kindness. And here the rabbis say, it's the end of the act of kindness as is written, and he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab. Who was he? He was buried. Who was buried? Moses, right. How do we know that this is the last act that God does in the entire Torah? Because the next column of Torah is about what happened after, and God is not there, but it's about sort of summarizing up the entire book of Deuteronomy. So what is God doing? What is God's last act in the Torah? Is to bury Moses. Why? I mean, first of all, why is God burying Moses and not the people? Anyone ever thought about that? God asks Moses to go up onto the mountain, and he goes out and sees the Shvelah, sees the beautiful promised land, the thing that he has been striving for his entire life, and that he has been foreclosed from actually entering. And then he lays down, and it says he lays down, and God takes his life. Yeah.
So is that the act of loving kindness? That after when he dies, God, there's a caring, and also says something about burial.
That's right. That's right.
Mitzvot and taking care of.
Right. So the act of loving, exactly right. So the act of loving kindness there is that after Moses' soul leaves Moses' body, he now just has a body, but there's no one around to bury him. So God took the time, out of all of the infinite power in the universe, the creator of the universe himself, right, took the time to bury a body. That is considered an act of chesed. Right? That's considered something that is full of love and compassion. And when we that's why, for example, in Jewish life, a funeral service has two parts. There's the part with the eulogy, There's the part where we say wonderful things about memory. And then there's the second part, which is the burial itself. In our Jewish customs, we bury our dead. We don't leave the dead for others to bury, because it is incumbent upon us to imitate God. And just as God buried Moses, we bury our loved ones. And that in Hebrew is called chesed shel emet. It is called the most truthful or deep version of chesed. Why? Because and every time you do anything for someone else, especially when you don't have to, you get something back in return. You get a smile. You get a thank you. You get a reputation of being a good person. Whether you mean it or not, whether that's your intention or not, there's always a little taking back in every act of giving that you give to someone else. Unless that person is dead. And you bury their body and they can never say thank you. They can never return the favor. Right? They can't repay something that you've given them. And so in that sense, the rabbis call burial chesed shel emet, which is the most truthful, most depthful, most important part of an act of loving kindness. And so God buries Moses. Moses can't say thank you. Moses can't return the favor, so to speak. And so the Torah begins with an act of chesed and ends with an act of chesed. And so from here, how do we define chesed so far? Yeah, how do you define this idea of chesed so far? Kindness. But what does that mean to be kind? Okay, an act of goodness towards someone else. Does that mean that if I'm a parent and I clothe my children, that I am being kind? No. So it has something else. It's not just a transitive act, right? It's not just something I'm doing for something else. There's got to be more to this. What else is...
Something that you were not forced to do it, you do it voluntarily.
Okay, good. It's not something you're forced to do, right? But you choose to do. And usually that can be an act of resistance against authority. That can be an act of just sweetness towards each other. Right? Now, I grew up in the South, and that means that we have our P's and Q's and sirs and madams and opening doors, et cetera, right? So if I open a door for someone who's older than me or a woman, is that an act of chesed in the South? No, it's not. That is an obligation, right? That is right. Right. But if you go the extra mile, right, I'll give you the best LA example, Los Angeles example of chesed you can do. Someone is on the freeway next to you and has their blinker on. And they want to move into your lane. And you know that there's a 1 mile between this, where you are, and the freeway interchange that they probably realize only now because they were texting while they were driving. That they don't know that, there's the 10 freeway, I got to get over. Their blinker is on, you're in bumper-to-bumper traffic. Do you let them in? Okay, usually you do, but you have to let them in? Sometimes. Right, it's an act of chesed to let them into your lane. There you go. Now here's an example, right? Now, you want a real act of chesed, is it 2 cars arrive at the same parking spot at Ralph's on a Friday afternoon? Right? I don't know very many people who are full of chesed in that moment. Right? Sure, you can have my parking space. Yeah, go ahead. I'll circle for the next 10 minutes, right? Wonderful. So the question is, what's the difference between a mitzvah and a chesed? At its minimum, a mitzvah fulfills the Torah obligation that you have to do something. It is a mitzvah to say a blessing before and after you eat a meal. It is a mitzvah, right? It is a mitzvah to wear tefillin in the morning if it's not Shabbat. It's a mitzvah to keep kosher. It's also a mitzvah to be good to each other. But if you're only being good to each other because it's a mitzvah, then it's just a mitzvah and it's not chesed. Okay, we're going to look into this right in our Torah portion. That's sort of the core of it. So let's get into the next couple of texts here on this sheet, and then we're going to dive into this week's Torah portion. Okay, this is from Avot Rabbi Natan, which is a commentary on Pirkei Avot. Okay, that's why it says Avot Rabbi Natan. It's a commentary. It says, how do we know the significance of acts of chesed? Prophet Hosea said, "For I desire acts of chesed and not sacrifice." The world began only with covenantal love, which is another term for chesed. As it says in Psalms, the world was built upon chesed. One time it happened that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was leaving Jerusalem, and Rabbi Yeshua was walking after him, and he saw the ruins of Solomon's temple. Rabbi Yeshua said, "Oi!" Yep, we said "oi" even all the way back then. "What a devastation for us that the place where Israel atoned for our sins had to be destroyed." Rabbi Yochanan replied, "My son, do not fear. We have another form of atonement that is just as effective." What is it? Acts of chesed. This is what the verse from Hosea means when it says, "For I desire acts of chesed and not sacrifice." So imagine these two rabbis. They lived during or just after the destruction of the temple. And if anyone's ever been to Jerusalem, you know the hills, right? So they're on one of the hills. And they didn't see a city all built up like we have today, thank God, right? They saw just ruins. And the first question they ask is, how do we connect with God if the very thing that we was created with the purpose of our God connection is destroyed? How do you connect with God when the temple is gone? I mean, the whole idea of the temple itself was the phone connection to heaven. And if you cut your end of the line, who's picking up the phone when the phone rings? You wouldn't even know it. And so they're out there, they're looking at the ruins of the temple, and what do they say? They say, well, I know how you can connect to God. I know how you can connect to God. I know how you can make atonement for your own internal sin. And that's to do acts of loving kindness. What are they really saying? Because on the one hand, they're saying avodah is gone. That second pillar is gone. So we have to redo it. And so we're going to lean more on chesed. But this question of atonement I find just fascinating. How can doing something for someone else atone for something you did poorly in the past? We see this today. It's a very human thing. Have you ever met someone who's really screwed up? Who's not your kids? And then have you ever sensed inside of them that they really were sorry? That they realize that they've come to a different place? And that they say, I've now dedicated my life to living differently. You ever seen someone like that? Yeah. So it's very human in a sense then to turn acts that are negative acts into positive acts. It's almost like, it's almost like psychological or spiritual alchemy, where you're turning lead into gold. You can change yourself. You can change your future. You can change your connection to the world and to the universe, and you can feel God in those moments by committing yourself to doing things that you don't have to do, but you choose to do because it is who you are as a human being. Look how powerful that is. And we're going to see some of that transformative moment in this Parsha too. All right, the last one I want to read here is from Sukkah, okay? Just the last one here, and then we'll come back after. The sages taught that acts of loving kindness are superior to charity in three respects. Charity can be performed with one's money, while acts of loving kindness can be performed both with money and without money. Charity is given to the poor, while acts of kindness are performed both for the poor and for the rich. Charity is given to the living, while acts of kindness are performed both for the living and for the dead. Now, I know that we're running a capital campaign, And I know that we're running an annual fund campaign, and the day school has an annual fund campaign. But here the rabbis are saying that chesed is more important than charity. How is chesed more important than charity? First of all, it says that charity is given through money. That's what tzedakah is, right? You have a little pushka, you put the little shekels in or whatever, right? Are acts of chesed only restricted to money? No, right? Helping someone when you don't have to. Like on Sunday, my family's going to one of our partnering organizations at VBS called Hope of the Valley Rescue Mission. There's about 30 families going on Sunday to do a Thanksgiving feeding program for the homeless. So, yeah, it costs us money to prepare the food, but we're not giving them money. We're feeding them dinner. That's an act of chesed, right?
Also, chesed, you don't expect anything in return. You do it because you want to do it.
Right. Well, in charity, I would hope you don't expect anything in return either. Right. Imagine if we were able to run a capital campaign to support the kids and the buildings of this institution, and instead of putting your name on the building, we put the teachers' names on the building because they're the ones who teach our kids. Imagine it instead of being called the such and such and such and such and such and such room, because they're the ones who gave the money, we called it the such teacher or such rabbi or such value room, because what we want to do is put our values on the walls, not our donors on the walls, right? So I would say that even charity, you don't necessarily expect anything in return, but we have a way of giving something back to people who give. All right, and chesed can also be done for rich people, not just for poor people. All you have to do is sit in an oncology ward with someone who you love, or someone you don't have to sit with them, but you're sitting with them while they're going through chemo. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor, they're suffering, and you're sitting at their bedside. Right? So you don't have to be rich or poor to receive an act of chesed. Yes?
Charity is also, let's say the person who's giving charity, he's got a lot of money.
Yeah.
For him to give a certain amount means really nothing. Where chesed, you have to give of yourself.
I would hope that you're giving enough in charity that you feel like you're giving something significant. Right? If you're only scraping the cream off the cappuccino and not pouring out a little bit of the coffee in terms of your charity work, I said, let's sit down and have lunch. But I understand what you're saying. There's an emotional component, right? There's a definitely emotion. Dov, I see you. Ask a question, and we're going to go to our Parsha.
The whole discussion. Chesed is subjective. It's what you think is good to give. But law tells you whether you like it or not, you give it. You run the society on law.
Right.
Law is objective.
Right.
And that's the way it works. An example. There's a law in the Torah. When you capture a city and you take a woman, you can't rape her.
Right.
You got to take her home, take care of her for a whole month, give her a time to get over her family, and then you may be able to marry her or take her as a second wife. Those people who are practicing chesed, like our Christian friends who have the mercy, they raped and murdered right on the scene.
Right.
Law is objective. These are the things you have to do for us to have a society.
Good.
But when you practice chesed, it's what I think is a good deed.
Okay, good. So what Dov is bringing up is a really, really important point. It's a philosophical point that chesed isn't enough to build a society around. Because if I just rely on acts of loving kindness to create a society that is just and peaceful, well, what happens if I'm not in the mood? What happens if I'm not in the mood? Let's say you and I have a agreement, not a legal agreement, but just an agreement. We're not going to steal from each other. And then I decide to break that agreement because, you know what? Your Ferrari just looks really nice and I want it, I can get it, and I'll take it. And you get angry at me. Well, you say, I understand where you're coming from, but I'm not feeling really chesedistic right now. I'm just not feeling really loving. I've been given to you forever. I want to do something for myself. So I decided to take your Ferrari. There's no recourse for that because you didn't break a law. On the other hand, you need laws to secure a society that is safe and hopefully prosperous for the largest number of people, that creates fairness. And so just because you want to be kind doesn't mean you can't back it up with the force of law. Flip the entire conversation over, though, and say, if we only had a society that was very strict on enforcing its laws, that society is not a good society, because that society isn't full of kindness. Because what happens, no law can prescribe every single circumstance that someone falls into. For example, we know that stealing is wrong, right? What happens if a 14-year-old steals a pack of gum from a 7-Eleven and is caught by the security guard? You're going to send him to jail? Maybe. Right? What'd you say? Okay, yeah, that is true. Let's be really clear that there's racial injustice when it comes to the strict enforcement of laws, especially around drugs and petty theft. Wouldn't it be better to call his or her parents and push it onto the parents to discipline that child in the hopes that this child won't become a danger or a menace? Right? That's an example of where you don't have to enforce the laws, prosecutorial discretion in certain situations, right? And that's because we want to create a society where kindness can come to inform the law. All right, all of that is to say, and then the last one, of course, is from that text is about the dead, which references the story of Moses, right, which we already looked at. Yeah, last thing, and then we're going to go right into our Parsha.
Just that in loving kindness, it doesn't demand or require, in fact, you don't do it to get an applause. You do it,
Right.
do it because you feel it's right.
Right. Even if you might receive gratitude from someone because you're doing an act of loving kindness, that shouldn't be the reason why you're doing an act of loving kindness, right? Just because you're going to help a lovely lady put groceries into the back of her car doesn't mean that you're doing that so that she'll think good of you or that she'll say thank you to do. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do or because you're a mensch and you're a good person and you want to help out. All right, so let's look at where chesed shows up in our Torah portions. We're in Chayei Sara. It's like page 131, 132. Let's start with page 130, okay? That was a 45 minutes introduction to our Torah portion. I'm only slightly faster than Rabbi Feinstein when it comes to the introductions. Okay. Chapter 24. Anyone who's got a book with me? Would you like one? Here, chapter 24. Thanks. Page 130 if you have the book, the red book, okay? So we're coming off of the first part of Chayei Sara where Sara has died and Abraham goes into a deep mourning period and secures a place, a cave called the Cave of Machpelah in the city of Hebron, okay? When that period has come to an end, chapter 24 opens for us. It says, Abraham was now old, advanced in his years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things, which itself is a wonderful, there's a whole sermon on what that means. And Abraham said to the senior servant of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, which we know from other texts is probably Eliezer. And he says, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife, or that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to the land of my birth, and get a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant said to him, what if the woman does not consent to follow me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham answered him, on no account must you take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my native land, those are quotes back from Parsha Lech Lecha, who promised me in an oath, saying, I will sign this land to your offspring. He will send his angel before you, and you will get a wife for my son there. And if the woman does not consent to follow you, you shall then be clear of this oath to me, but do not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore to him to do as he's bidding. So here Eliezer and Abraham are having a conversation. They hold each other under their thighs, which is a way of making a promissory oath. And what is Abraham asking of Eliezer? Go find a son for my wife Isaac. What did I say? Oh, sorry, a wife for, thank you. A wife for my son Isaac, right? And we know that Isaac, we know from biblical times that there are arranged marriages, right? So I'm trying to take off my sort of feminist, postmodern viewpoint here. I just want to get into the text because we're going to get to this interesting question of chesed, right? And what was the question that Eliezer asked Abraham? What if I can't find the right wife, the right woman for him? Oh, what if she wouldn't come? Thank you. So what if she wouldn't come back? Right? This becomes a central question about Isaac, because Isaac's the only patriarch who never left the land of Israel. Abraham, we know, goes down to Egypt at one point. Jacob certainly goes down to Egypt at one point. Isaac never leaves the land. And this kind of makes clear that his job is never to leave the land, right? So what if she doesn't want to come back? Right? So if I was telling this story, we have 2 points of tension. The first is, will I find a woman? And the second is, will that woman come back? Okay? So then the servant took his master's camels and set out, 10 of his master's camels and set out. They took him with him. They went through the city of Nahor, and he made the camels kneel down by the well outside the city at evening time, at the time when women came out to draw water. And he said, and here is really important. So here, Eliezer, it travels back north and back towards Ur Kasdim, which is where Abraham came from, but they're going up to Haran and then over to Nahor. And now he's got his big caravan of camels. They arrive at a well outside the city, and here Eliezer makes a little prayer. He says, and I'll read it in Hebrew first, Adonai Elohei Adonai Avraham, Hakera na lifnei hayom va'aseh chesed im Adoni Avraham. Hine anochi nitzav al ayin mayim, ubanot anshe ha'ir yatzot lesof mayim. So here Eliezer says, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, grant me good fortune this day. And here it says, deal graciously with my master Abraham. Here I stand by the spring as the daughters of the townsmen come out to draw water. Let the maiden to whom I say, please lower your jar and I may drink, and who replies, drink, and I will also water your camels. Let her be the one whom you decreed for your servant Isaac. Thereby shall I know that you have dealt graciously with my master. Here again using the word chesed. Ki asita chesed im Adoni. Okay, so Eliezer is making like a little prayer here. What is this prayer? What's his prayer condition? What's he asking for? There's the specific and the general. What's the specific thing that he's asking for? Oh, but what's he asking? What's the specific, very, very specific thing he's asking for? He's not asking for kindness yet. That's the general thing. What's the specific thing? Be very specific.
Well, I'd like God to help him find this right woman who will commit an act of chesed.
Right. And what is the act of chesed that he's asking for? Water, right?
But not just him, but also his camel.
Also his camel. How many camels? 10. How much water can 10 camels drink after a long journey? That's a lot of work, by the way, okay? I mean, that's like, may I find a woman who won't just put gas in my car, but put gas in my friends' cars, gas in my, cousins' cars, right? Fill up my entire fleet, right? It's a lot of work. Especially camels, right? They have an entire hump that's just devoted to storing water. Now, what is it that he's asking in general, right? The most general thing is he's asking for a woman who embodies this characteristic of chesed. Except, look at the prayer really closely.
Generous in kindness.
Right. Well, kindness, or we're going to call it chesed for the sake of this conversation. What's he asking? Look really closely. Really closely. Whose chesed is he asking for? Is he asking for the woman's chesed, or is he asking for God's chesed? Right. I mean, the complicated answer is both, right? We're looking for both the chesed from God and because it's embodied in the chesed of a human being. You see where the rabbis get this idea? Yeah, go ahead. Is it the same thing? I don't know if it's the same thing. We could easily assume it's not the same thing. In fact, we could assume that God is really capricious. God is really strict in judgment. God lets the whims of the world sweep over the world itself. God lets us suffer. God lets us die. God took us from our own land. All depending on how you look at it, it's human beings who are full of chesed. It's human beings who do things that they don't have to do. That's one way of looking at it. And that's certainly, by the way, that some of our friends from other religious traditions look at our God. And yet this text predates the text about the temple that we read by thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And here, even in its core, it commingles God's chesed with the active chesed of human beings. I think about that. I think about Rabbi Scholais, and I think about the work he's dedicated his life to making God knowledgeable, touchable by each and every one of us, by sublimating what we understood to be the subject of God into the predicate. That is to say, it's not about God being full of chesed, it's about human beings acting out of chesed, and that, therefore, is godly. We call the things that we think are immaculate godly. And a woman who is willing to work this hard out of a sense of kindness is a godly woman. That's what Rabbi Scholais would say. I would argue that this text, I'm not as predicately focused as Rabbi Scholais was in terms of my relationship to God, but I would argue that the coupling of the two together, which is all over rabbinic literature, which we saw, is meant to show us that our God does have, even in the Bible, a sense of worthiness and a sense of grace. What Eliezer is praying for is showing how God's chesed acts in the world through the acts of another human being. And we know how the story goes, right? What happens next? Beautiful young lady, sweet, carrying a jug of water, goes to the well, fills it up, and brings it to Eliezer and says, "Welcome. You want some water?" And he says, "Sure," drinking pensively, waiting to see what happens next, right? It's like, oh, you can film a movie that's better than this, right? Like, she'll bring him the water, he's drinking, he close up on his eyes, looking at her, saying, "Is she going to ask me? Is she going to ask me?" And then, sure enough, change of music, the music swells, and she says, "Would you camels like to have something to drink too? I'm happy to help you." Right? So the first moment of tension that in the oath part comes to fruition, right? Yeah. Yes, please.
What I'm also hearing is the partnership. You know, briefly, what I was raised in or heard about was a command. You do this because I say you do this from
Right.
God.
Right.
Instead of this loving kindness partnership, because
Why are you getting to the end of my talk before I get to the end of my talk?
you're doing great.
Okay.
That's why.
I'm going to come back to that before we end, because that's kind of where I want to go. Okay, so thank you for... No, it's okay. Okay, so here, Rebecca agrees to give him water, right? She says, right, so he had scarcely finished speaking when Rebecca, who was born of Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. Now, of course, the Torah is very clear. She's related. That's why they have all those names in there, is because she's related. Don't think she's just a stranger, right? Came out with her jar on her shoulder. That's the iconic image of Rebecca. The maiden was very beautiful, a virgin whom man had not yet known. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. The servant then ran toward her, saying, "Please, let me sip a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her hand to let him drink. And when she had let him drink his fill, she said, "I will also draw water for your camels until they finish drinking." Quickly emptying her jar into the trough, she ran back to the well to draw, and she drew all for all his camels. The man, meanwhile, stood gazing at her, silently wondering whether the Lord had made his errand successful or not. And when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing 1/2 shekel, which is supposed to be pretty heavy, and 2 gold bands for her arms, 10 shekels in weight, very heavy. "Pray tell me," he said, "whose daughter are you? Is there a room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She replied, "I am the daughter of Betuel, son of Milcah, whose name she bore to Nahor." And when she went on, "There is plenty of straw and feed at home, and also room to spend the night." The man bowed low in homage to the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master, Abraham, who has not withheld his steadfast faithfulness from my master, for I have been guided on my errand by the Lord to the house of my master's kinman." So in Hebrew it says, "Baruch Adonai Elohei Adonai Avraham, asher lo azav chasdo, va'amito me'im Adonai anochi b'derech, nechoni Adonai beit achi Adonai." So here again the word chesed is mentioned. So, yes, Bruce.
So there's one reading of this which is focused on chesed.
Right.
And there's another reading on this which is he shows up with his fleet of Ferraris.
Right.
And hands out gold jewelry.
Uh-huh.
In a minute, Lavan is going to show up and notice the jewelry and notice the camels.
That's correct.
And so there's another reading of this which is more economic and less chesed.
Okay. Which is that Laban sees an opportunity, as a capitalist should, and he says, how do I then take advantage of this situation?
Correct.
Right. I'll tell you that Laban has never been viewed positively anywhere in the Torah. After all, Laban sees an advantage later on when Jacob wants to marry his daughters, right? And takes advantage of him there too.
And the first thing he notices is the jewelry.
Of course. Right. So I would say this. Laban is the black hat and Abraham is the white hat. You can't understand the goodness of Abraham till you understand men like Laban. And in fact, a Hasidic reading of this text would show that even in those economic conditions, with those terrible people, Rebekah still had a sense of chesed. She's very much unlike her family. And all the more so than she's the one for whom Isaac should marry. Now we do know that later she's got a little Laban in her. How do we know that? Because when her son Isaac becomes blind and old, she manipulates a situation to the advantage of Yaakov over Esau, right? Right? Her son is Yaakov, is it not? Rebekah's son. No. Her husband Isaac, when he became blind, she manipulates the situation to advantage Yaakov over Esau, right? So we know that. So what I want to do, though, is just to go back to this partnership thing, right? So Rebekah not only gives him something to drink, and not only gives his camels enough to drink, she says there's plenty of food and straw and a place for you to spend the night. I mean, he asked her, is there room? And she says, absolutely there's room. She could have said no. And she said yes. Right? So here again, then Eliezer sees that example of someone giving of themselves in a non-required way.
I have to go to the library.
Please.
Sorry.
Go. He says he makes a blessing out of that. And who does he attribute the blessing to? To God. There's always different ways of reading this. But in this case, Eliezer is reading actions that happen in human life from a poetic standpoint that says this is a reflection of God's chesed in the world. Never before in the book of Breshit, in Genesis, is chesed even mentioned as being attributed to God, until now. And then if you fast forward with me, if you will, to the 34th chapter of Exodus, suddenly you'll see where this comes into its fullest fruition. That would be chapter 34, page, I think it's page 541. Everyone still with me? Only got a couple minutes left, so. 541, verse 4. So we're no longer on a family-to-family situation. We're on a nation-to-nation situation. When we go down to Egypt and we get transformed from a clan into a nation, in fact, the word Am, which means nation in Hebrew, is not used at all in the book of Genesis. It's only used in the book of Exodus. It only shows up there in Exodus. So we become a nation, an Am Yisrael. We are liberated from Egypt. We go to Mount Sinai. We're celebrating at Mount Sinai. Moses takes too long going up there in his meeting with God. A very Jewish meeting takes way too long. That was a joke. Let's see if you're still awake. Maybe it's a Jewish communal professional joke. I don't know. Anyway, and then what do? They build a golden calf. And Aaron says, this is God. They bow down to the calf. God gets a little angry at that, to say the least, right? What does Moses do? He runs down the mountain, and what does he do? Throws down the tablets, right? Then there's a punishment phase. And now the question is, what do you do with these people that just totally undermine the entire Exodus project? What do you do with these people? He punishes them, but then what does he do after the punishment? God says, make me another set of tablets. So verse 4. So Moses carved 2 tablets of stone like the first, and early in the morning he went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord commanded him, taking the 2 stone tablets with him. So I just want to be really clear. Let's be really crystal clear. Where did Moses carve the second tablets? On Mount Sinai? Huh? That's right. Carved with the people. So the energy is going the other way. It's going up instead of down. Okay? The Lord came down in a cloud. God stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him in a cloud and proclaimed, and here I'll read the Hebrew, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet. Notzer Chesed la'olafim, Nosei Avon v'Fesha v'Chata v'Nakeh, Lo Yinakeh Pakod Avon Avot, Al Banim, Al Banei Banim, Al Shoshim v'Al Ribeim. Okay. So here, Moses then takes the tablets and goes up to Mount Sinai with the newly carved tablets. And God comes down in a cloud, passes before him, and then we have God's name. Right? And we know this from Rosh Hashanah and from Yom Kippur, because we sing this, right? God is, and it says, for the first time it says, Adonai, Adonai, God is El Rachum v'Chanun. God is full of compassion and grace. Erech Apayim, which means God has a long face. Right? A long face is a euphemism for being kind, as opposed to a fiery nostril, which is a euphemism for being angry. Right? A long, right? That's kind of like a long face. That's what it means, right? Kind. And then Rav Chesed ve'emet. God is full of chesed. So much so that God is willing to requite the sins. Right? God noser chesed la'olafim, nosei avon v'fesha v'chateh v'nakeh. God is willing to give you forgiveness. Now, if you do sin, we got problems. But those problems in a universalistic context only last a few generations, which, of course, as a human being, feels like a really long time. But from God's perspective, is pretty short. Our God, then, is a God who's full of chesed. So how do you see God in this context? God could have been really wrathful. God could have destroyed the entire Jewish people at the base of Mount Sinai after the golden calf and said, let's start over. God could have destroyed the world. God made a promise not to, but God could have broken God's own promise. God could have said 100 other things. God could have chosen another people. And yet God didn't. After the worst sin our people have ever committed against God in the Torah, at the foot of Mount Sinai, when we're supposed to be getting the Torah itself, God said, I forgive you. And so God's attribute then of chesed is core to God's being. So that leads me now to the final conversation. Let's go back to this text sheet. Let's go to the very last text on the back page, okay? It says Brachot 7a, okay? Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, from where is it derived that the Holy Blessed One prays? As it said from book of Isaiah, I will bring them to my holy mountain and make them joyful in the house of my prayer. The verse does not say the house of their prayer, but rather the house of my prayer. From here we see that the Holy Blessed One prays. So when Isaiah says, is everyone with me? When Isaiah says, house of my prayer, it's not just their prayer, that is a prayer of the people, but my prayer itself. Then the Gemara deigns to ask what is the most important question. If God prays, what does God pray? Rav Zuta bar Tuvia said, that Rav said, God says, may it be my will that my mercy will overcome my anger and my mercy prevail over my other attributes, and may I conduct myself towards my children Israel with the attribute of mercy, and may I enter before them beyond the letter of the law. The Talmud, which was written in exile, the Talmud, which was a book written by oppressed people, who saw their land destroyed, their temple destroyed, their people dispersed, murdered, raped, kidnapped. What's the number one thing that they're actually looking for from God? In the law book itself. They're looking for a God of chesed. So much so that they've come up with a fantasy, a text, that if you were to go up to heaven, God is praying for God's own chesed. And of course, the irony of all of this is that it's written in the Talmud, in our law book. Imagine if we had a law book, a penal code in the United States that is written with kindness, love, and compassion, is written into the law itself. The mafia would run the world. Maybe. You might be right. But what's great about it being a religious law code and not a secular law code, right, is that we can do this because this is what we want. At least I think this is what we want. One second, Dan. So when I think about what other people say about our religion, that God just commands and we have to just obey, that the only way to be Jewish is to fulfill God's shopping list of demands. Right? Sort of like God, I don't know if this works for you, but God runs Instacart and we're just getting the little thing saying, go buy me this, and this, and then deliver it to God's house, and then you get a thank you maybe, but our God doesn't even eat, so I don't even know that metaphor works, but you understand, like, as opposed to looking at the commandments of being in the covenant as just fulfilling a shopping list given to us by the master of the universe, what the rabbis have always tried to view this as is that God is asking us to condition ourselves through law of looking beyond the letter of the law, but conditioning the human being towards goodness, towards kindness, towards mercy, towards accountability, because you can't have any of those things without being accountable. And that what we've always thought of as a Torah that is just full of commandments is equally full of acts of chesed. And that God, who is the commander, is actually the creator of chesed itself, and that it stands as a co-equal pillar of the world, as much as the law does itself. Right? Question? Yeah?
What does Rav
What about which part? He would agree. He would agree with me. He would say you have to follow the law. And I would still say you have to follow the law. I see halacha as my spiritual discipline. Like I participate in that. But it's about conditioning the character. We obligate ourselves to be in the covenant and to follow the law today. Not because we want to live in a world where I just am burdened all the time. But I'm actually feel free, more free, because I feel like my life has purpose. I feel like my life has direction. And that I'm not just checking off a list. I'm not just going out from an obligation. It's in Hebrew called yotzei, being yotzei chovato, which means to go out from an obligation. I'm actually entering into a relationship. So it's not a going out, it's a coming in. And it's an act, to me that's done through acts of loving kindness as filtered in our law code itself. Yeah. Any other questions? But
It's still subjective.
Sure. Dov says it's still subjective. That's true. That's why we need the law, right? Like in the law, in the area of the law that you had quoted to me earlier about the war, right? It's also, you're obligated when you siege a city, right? It's the only law code I know where it says when you siege a city, you're only allowed to siege it on 3 sides out of 4. Why? So the innocent people can escape. There's no such thing as a siege to death. It is a siege to surrender, not a siege to death, right? And that's because you don't have to do that. But we're required to do that because we're trying to condition ourselves that even when we fight in our most difficult moments, that we uphold the sanctity of life. Right? Yeah.
It's almost like you're required to do chesed until you want to.
That's right. And also, we want you to do chesed so the law reflects chesed, right? It's both. And I think it's almost like to switch metaphors, almost like you're playing a hockey and you cross-check, right? That might be too much of a sports metaphor for here. Or you're grappling and you're pushing back a tug of war, right? Did chesed come first or did the law come first? Did chesed come first? You can't have a condition of chesed unless you create a society that's conditioned towards chesed, but you also can't create a law code of chesed unless the people writing the law already are conditioned towards chesed. So it is a back and forth, which is a wonderful Gordian knot. Because it's not a knot, it's a knot I don't want to untie, right? So, yeah. Yes, last comment, then we got to close.
Something that moved me a lot within this reading is that when the servant prays to God and says, God, please come through. I don't know if you're going to come through. And it made me think about times in my life when I lose faith, when I feel despair, hopelessness.
Sure.
And it's the reminder of, oh, God came through, and of course I experienced that in my own life. And it's a very moving, very significant part.
Right. And God might not come through for you in the way that you, exactly like you expected, but you might find that someone else's kindness for you, even if it's not articulated in the same way, someone else's kindness for you is in fact something that you need to feel saved. Right? Yeah. All right, last comment, I promise. Yeah.
I'll have 2 half comments. Would a rabbi show us consider, what would he consider godliness? Would he consider chesed as godliness?
Okay, and tell me your other question, and I'll try to answer them together.
The other one is, when was the concept of these 3 together introduced, historically speaking?
Torah, Avodah, Chesed. Okay, good. So the question is, what would Rabbi Shlois think about Chesed as godliness? And then the second one is, when did the concept of Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chesed come into sort of maturation as a Jewish concept? So I'll start with the second one, since it's historical. The Mishnah, Pirkei Avot that we have here, which is where we started today, was codified around the year 150, but it was floating in the ether before that. So it was probably at least a couple hundred years earlier than that. So we're talking about the turn of the millennia, and it was written down. It was written down, attributed to Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, who's the person who wrote this down, and it was probably his way of trying to grapple with all the same ideas that we're grappling with this morning. He just did it 2,000 years ago, which means the Jews, we change and we don't change, right? And then what Rabbi Shlois would say is acts of chesed are probably the best examples of godliness in the world. when you act by feeding the hungry. You don't have to feed the hungry, but you have to feed the hungry. That makes it godly, right? And in fact, this text, I just want to, as a personal note, my relationship with the rabbi, this text from Sota that I quoted, 14a, and then on the back there's a longer version of it. That was the text I taught at his eulogy, at his funeral, at the Hesped here in the shul, because I was asked to teach a text in his name, and I couldn't think of a text that was better embodying who he was than understanding that acts of loving kindness are the things that we call godly. Okay? And with that, I'll say a Shabbat Shalom to each and every one of you. Have a lovely day. If you could put the red books back on stacks, please, because there is another minion that's meeting in here in just a few minutes. And if you have a coffee cup or a tea cup, just take that with you, because we have another service in here. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.